So before we get going, just a couple of words about what we're going to be covering today. First off, I've had people call, I've had some emails about this class, and they've asked, do I have to have Microsoft Word to take part in this? You absolutely do not. It's just information that can be beneficial for someone using someone else's computer, for using an online version of Word, or some other program. If you do have Word at home, it does not matter how old that program is. Everything we're going to be talking about today works with every version of Word, whether it be 2000, which is what I started using, all the way to today's 2019 version. If you are using anything from 2010 to 2019, it's going to look very similar to what I'm circling here on the screen. If you are using anything older than 2003, it's going to look a little different. The files will save as a different, what's called an extension. At the end of the file, it'll say .doc instead of .docx. But for the most part, employers will be able to open those just fine. So a couple other things before we get going. If you've taken the previous versions of the Word training we've offered here in the last couple of months, you might ask, well, what's different about today? Well, today is focused solely on what you need to create a resume. We had some three-part series of Word trainings in the last couple of months that were focused on Word as a whole. Not all of that is relevant to resumes, and I do realize that not everyone creating a resume necessarily has to have those skills for a particular job. However, if you want some more training on Word, here are the links. I will send all of this information out by Monday morning. What you'll also get is a recording of today's presentation, and you can watch it as many times as you feel the need to, and a copy of the slide deck with all the notes. Yeah, real quick comment in the chat box. Yeah, if you have a Mac, it'll look a little bit different. You can have MS Word for Mac. In fact, there's a whole Office suite, Microsoft Office for Mac. It'll look a little bit different, and it will save a little bit different. So it's not a bad idea to see what it looks like on the other end. Sometimes you have to tweak it just a little bit format-wise. Sometimes something that's on one page on your machine will open up on 2 pages on an employer's machine. And I have seen a few issues with that when you're using Word on a Mac. All right. So next up, we're going to talk about some additional options you have for creating a Word document. If you don't want to go out and plop down $100, $200, $500 for a Office suite, or you don't want to pay the monthly fee for Office 365, you can do it in a free way by either creating a Microsoft account, doing something called LibreOffice, which is a download, or using Google Docs. All 3 of those will allow you to create a resume that is compatible with Microsoft Word. I'm just going to run through this very quickly. I've done this before in previous classes. However, this is a question I get quite a bit. So to create a free Microsoft account, all you have to do is go to the website above, login.live.com, and create a new email address. Now, of course, if you have a Outlook account, if you have a MSN account, or a Hotmail account even, you've already had access to this all along. Most people just use email for email, but there are other services that are included with Google accounts, with Microsoft accounts. And one of the really nice ones is that there's a word processor embedded with both of those accounts. So if you log into your Outlook or MSN account, you'll go to the left-hand side, this thing called a waffle or an application launcher, and you'll just choose Microsoft Word. And what you can do with that is you can create Word documents. Now, this is a simple tool. It's not everything that Word does, but it's everything we're doing today. So you can do all of the stuff we're talking about today within this free service, which is pretty awesome. And you can also save your documents directly to the cloud. That sounds like a really fancy term. That just means you're saving it on someone else's computer. The beauty of that is, and I highly recommend this for your resume, is you have access to your resume anywhere you happen to be that has internet access. So if you are on vacation someplace and you need your resume, it's on your phone because your phone is tied to that account. If you are at someone else's house and you need to get your resume, or at a library, or an internet cafe, boy, that's an old term, all you have to do is log into your account, and one of the other options on that drop-down, on that waffle, is OneDrive. And OneDrive is just a storage place that you can put all of your files and store in the cloud. All right, another comment here. LibreOffice is pretty cool. Boy, I'd like to hear that. I've been using LibreOffice for as long as it's been around. Its predecessor was something called OpenOffice, which is also still around. It's just a free suite of Office software that includes a Word clone, an Excel clone, and various other ones. All you have to do is download it. There are no ads on here. There are no extra downloads that happen. This is a safe site, otherwise it would not show it to you. They certainly do allow you to donate to them because they are a nonprofit, but it is safe software, and it is truly free. You just have to make sure that you're downloading the correct version. If you have a newer computer within the last 8 years or so, it's going to be a 64-bit. Of course, you could download this for a Mac too, but once you click on that, it's real simple to do. They walk you through it step by step, and you get something like this that looks very, very similar to Microsoft Word. And again, everything I'm going to be talking about today can be done in a similar fashion with LibreOffice. And then the last option I'm going to give you, and the reason I'm giving it to you as the last option, is it's the one that I would not recommend as highly as the other two. Google Docs is something that a lot of people are very familiar with because they've used it in an academic situation. I have several kids in school right now, and because of the distance learning, much of their day is spent on Google Docs or Google Sheets or Google, I think it's Present, whatever the PowerPoint version is. And it's great because it's very easy for them to submit their work and for a teacher in a distance situation to receive that work. I'm not saying you couldn't use it for your resume. You certainly could, but I would recommend that if you do create a resume in Google Docs, you export it as a Word document. One of the things I've seen a lot of people try to do is they try to send an employer a link to a Google Doc. All right. Thank you, Gloria. So as an employer, if I receive a link to a file that I have to click on, I'm going to be very cautious that that might be a virus. In fact, I've gotten a virus from a Google Doc link. So just be a little cautious of that. To create a Google Doc, all you have to do is click on the waffle here. It's on the right-hand side this time, over here. And there's one extra step. Instead of going right to your software, you go to Drive, which is the cloud storage for your Google account. Once you open that, you go on New, and then you choose Google Docs. And then you choose Blank Document. Okay. And again, you're going to get a very similar program to everything we're going to talk about today. All right, let's just see if there's any questions in the chat box. Does LibreOffice have an extension as a text or a .doc? Okay, so natively, that's a great question. Natively, I believe it's ODT, Open Document Text, or something like that, ODF, Open Document Format. So when you save any program, and I'm going to, any file, it'll be very similar to what I'm about to show you. So I hope everyone is seeing a Word document. Just give me a yes or no if you're seeing a Word document here. Yes, thank you, Mary. Okay, so whenever you save any file in any program, you're going to do something very similar. You're going to click on like File, and you're going to Save, and then you get this Save As dialog box. It'll look very similar to LibreOffice. It's a little bit different in Google Docs because it saves as you go. But here, what you're going to do is on the bottom where it says Save As Type, in LibreOffice, it's going to say ODF initially. You can change that, but make sure that you at least look at that because there are tons of different types of files. I think ODF is in here somewhere also. But all you have to do is change it to Word document .docx. That's what you're looking for the most current version of the Word format. This would also be how you would convert your Word document to a PDF. We'll talk more about that later. But again, it's going to File and Save As or Save, and then changing the Save As type to the correct format, which is .docx. All right, can employers open the LibreOffice resume? Here's the cool thing, otherwise I wouldn't even talk about it. They don't know the difference. If you save it as a .docx file, meaning you save it as a Word file, and you send it to them, it's going to open up in Word when they click on it. In fact, I've had better success with formats carrying over properly from a Libre situation than having actually Microsoft Word installed on a Mac. I've had more problems with that, formats carrying over appropriately. So LibreOffice has been pretty foolproof, and honestly, it's free. If I didn't have Word supplied to me by my employer, I'd be using LibreOffice, and I do on several of the machines I run. All right. So I'm going to be going back and forth between the PowerPoint and Word because I'd really like the opportunity to be able to demonstrate much of what I'm talking about today. I'm going to take one more quick question here. When you export a Google Doc as a Word document, that was the question. How do I convert a Google Doc to a Word doc? Let me just get something up here real quick. I'm going to open up a Google Doc and from my own account, and I'm going to show you how that's done. While I'm doing that, Glory, could you do a quick test to see if your mic is now working? Okay, and that's fine. So here's my Google account. And here is a folder I keep, Art's job folder, and I keep a version of my resume always on there so that if I have to quickly apply for something, I can do that. But when you have a Google account or a Google document, I have uploaded these as a as a Word document. That's why it says .docx. But if I were to create a new Google Doc, I'll demonstrate quickly how that works. I'll put some information on there. In this case, I have one piece of information. What's different about this than having something installed on your computer is that as you type, it saves. And if you have a slow internet connection, you're going to have some issues. So I would just click on File, and I would go to, I could download this as Word document. And that's all you really have to do. Okay? Hope that answered your question. So convert this to a Word document, File, Download, Word document. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on here. So why does format matter? Why can't we just type this in to a text document? I mean, there are included in every computer you have ever owned, there is a word processing program, a simple text editor called Notepad for Windows computers. In fact, there's even a step up from that called WordPad that even works almost exactly like a simple version of Word. Why don't we just do it in that? Well, here's the difference. If I put something in as a simple text document, it could look like this. And I've seen resumes like this. All the information's there. I've got the contact information. This could be adjusted a little bit, but it looks more like a letter. It doesn't look like a resume. Now, if I were to format this properly, here's what it would look like. Now, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by saying which one would you prefer as an employer, because then someone's going to be silly and say, I like the left one. It's simpler to read. Truly, this is the expectation. It doesn't have to look exactly like this, obviously. It can look simpler than this, but it should look like a resume. It should have a heading that's centered or somehow formatted to make it look like a heading. It should have some section headings that are bolded or otherwise stand out. I think a resume looks better with bullets to draw your eyes to a list, and then it should have some alignments. So those are some things to think about why you invest the time and effort into learning how to do this, okay? So what we're going to cover today is we're going to look at just the basics. And then I'll answer any questions above and beyond that. We'll be talking about fonts, what to use, what not to use. That's almost more important. We'll talk about appropriate margins and how to set them. We'll talk about bolding, underlining, and italics. Now, most people know how to do that, but use cases is what we'll talk about. We'll talk about alignments. That's just where your text lines up in a paragraph. There are some things to think about along those. Some people will overuse certain types of alignments, and that doesn't necessarily make your resume look very professional. In line with that, we're going to talk about something called spacing before and after paragraphs. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, and this looks a lot more complicated than all the other things, is it is an issue that most people run into when they create a resume with a more modern word processor. And there's a really quick, easy way around that. And then we'll talk about indenting and bulleting. All right, so I see a question in the chat box about the size of fonts. So let's go right into fonts. Perfect segue, by the way. Thank you, Rhonda. There are many different fonts you can use in a resume. There are many appropriate fonts you can use in a resume. The most common one today is Calibri. There's a lot of different ways to pronounce that, by the way. Calibri, whatever you want to call it, has been the default font since I think 2007 or 2010. When I say the word default, that just means that when you open up Microsoft Word, it comes with a bunch of preset options. Your text is black. Your font is Calibri. Your size is 11 point. Your alignment's left. Your margins are 1 inch. All of those things are preset for you. They can all be changed, but it's usually taking the best guess at what you would like to have your document look like. And I mean that there's no situational part with the initial template that you work with Word. However, you can overlay an entirely new set of default formats by opening up a new template. And that's why Word comes with a bunch of templates installed with it. And there are some templates that use the resume format, meaning that it's pre-formatted to be set up as a resume. I'll talk more about that as we go along, but for fonts, the traditional size fonts used to be 12 point. That looks a little big right now. I would recommend 11 point. I would go up to 12. I wouldn't go any lower than 10. So that means you have a little tiny window between 10 and 12. The reason I say that is anything above looks really big, anything below is hard to read. You don't want to bring your resume down to a certain size by drastically changing your font size because that's not the best way to do it. I would format for content, or I would edit for content to remove some things. You can slightly adjust your margins and some spacing. There's ways of slightly making up some space or adding some space. But if it's half a page, then go to 2 pages. You know, that's one of the most common questions I get too, is how many pages should a resume be? For an entry-level job, I would say 1 page, definitely 1 page. For some jobs I apply for, because I can talk about what's relevant within 1 page, I think it's a courtesy to an employer to say, here's everything you need to know on 1 page. If it's a highly technical position that has a huge job description, then you may have to go to 2 pages. You may have to go to 3, who knows? But the rule of thumb generally is 1 to 2 pages, and unless you have a reason to go to 2, stay at 1. Now, having said that, let's say that you have a Tahoma resume, meaning that your font is in the Tahoma font. I mean, it's in the Tahoma type. And it's, in this case, I have these all set at 16-point font, and that just means the size. Point is size in fonts. Notice that 16-point Tahoma is much bigger than 16-point Calibri. It's thicker, it's longer, even though they're both 16-point. So when you change your font, make sure it doesn't jump your resume over to an additional page. I've seen that happen. So these are what are called sans serif fonts, Calibri, Tahoma, and Arial, meaning that they don't have any embellishments or what I call doohickeys to kind of make it harder to read. Times New Roman was the default font for many years in Word. In fact, many people still have their resume in Times New Roman. I tend to think it makes it look a little older and it's a little harder to read. So I don't really care which font you use. The trick I use is I go to the company website. If I'm applying for a company, I go to their website and I copy and paste some information from their website onto a Word document. And most of the time that will show me then what font they are using. And that's probably their branded font. Most companies don't want to have their employees sending out a bunch of different types of styles. They don't want, one document to be sent out in Times New Roman and another in Arial and another in Tahoma. So they come to an agreement on here's the branded font for our organization. And because I want to be something that's familiar to them, when I send them my resume, I send it in their branded font. Whether they notice or not, I have no idea. But I figure it can't hurt, so I try it. All right. Any questions about fonts before we move on? I'll look through. No. All right. So someone mentioned, they said that Windows 10 does not include Notepad. Yes, it does. I have Windows 10 and Notepad is on there. It's a little harder to find because of the way it's set up, but if you go to your search bar on your taskbar, you can type in Notepad and Notepad will pop up. All right, next we're going to talk about margins. So margins is this area around your document. We call it white space, and now it's blue space. I put a little area, a little shape around there. This has a really big impact on how the initial impression of your resume is viewed. So if I were to look at a resume that had margins that were really small, and by the way, this is one of the settings you can put it at. It's called narrow margins. This is 0.5 inches all the way around. It's very hard to read. It's less inviting. Anything bigger than an inch, though, would look like you would in fact be wasting space. In Office 2003, they had 1.25 margins as the default, meaning that you're giving up an extra half an inch of space on your document, a quarter inch on each side. And it really looks, by today's standard, like a waste of space. So let me show you how you set those margins. So here's a Word document. You would go to the Page Layout tab, and you would click on Margins. And there's a bunch of presets. I really recommend you use the 1 inch. If you want to slightly adjust that, usually the presets aren't going to help you. You're going to go to Custom Margins. And I will go as low as 0.8, but I want to make sure that I do 0.8 all the way around. I want to mirror those margins top and bottom. I just think it looks more crisp, looks crisper. So I would put them at 0.8 all the way around, and then I would click OK. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you're sending out a reference sheet, and you should always send a reference sheet as a separate document from your resume. Don't put your references on your resume. In fact, I don't even put excellent references available upon request at the bottom of my resume because I send it as a separate document. Keep the same font, the same margins, the same general look, same heading, with your address on all 3 documents, your reference sheet, your resume, and your cover letter. And this is what I call personal branding. And it just makes a more cohesive look to the presentation you're giving employers. No employer is saying we're looking for that, but they do notice it because it just looks, I guess, again, it's a cleaner presentation. All right. Question here, is it okay to use a half-inch margin? I don't believe it is. That's the 0.5. This is an example of a 0.5. And all the feedback I've gotten is that, and me personally, it looks too crowded. I know we try to adjust the margins and slightly put them out so that our resume gets to that 1 page. If you have to do it to that level, edit for content. Maybe mess with the spacing of your spacings, meaning that instead of having a full line in between 2 sections, maybe you make it a half a line. There's a lot of different things you can do to tweak that. Another question is, should you always send references? So in the hiring process, every employer is different, and if you have specific knowledge of an employer, that always trumps anything I'm going to say. But most employers will, at some point, if they're interested in you, need your references. Some of them ask for it at application. Have them ready. You know, don't think of it at that point. In fact, I was helping my daughter fill out an application the other night, and she said, "Who should I use for references?" I'm like, that's something we should be thinking about before we start filling out the application, because that wasn't very well thought out who was going to be included. So think about that now. Put it on a separate document. If you have to put it into the application, you can certainly do that. However, very few will check them at application. Yeah, and someone's saying here, I've been told not to send more than they request. Yes. So I always bring my references to the interview. If they allow for a cover letter, I absolutely do that because they're allowing for it. But if they don't ask for the references, I don't give them to them at that point. I do bring them to the interview, though. And if they don't ask for them at the interview, I do leave it with them because I leave them with a job portfolio. I'll be talking more about job portfolios in next week's job club, which happens on next Tuesday. And the follow-up information I'll be sending for this class, I'll give you the link to register for that if you're interested, and that will delve more into applications and portfolios. All right, so standard formats, and these are just the most obvious ones that we use. And I'll show you where they're located. They're on the home tab of the ribbon. This whole area, by the way, is called the ribbon. They're comprised of various tabs. On the font grouping of the home tab, I know that's a lot of terminology, but home tab, font grouping, we have some basic formats. We have bolding, italicize, and underline. And by the way, if you've ever heard the term keyboard shortcut, it's going to show you what the keyboard shortcut is for each of these formats when you hover over them. So in this case, it's Control-B. All that means is if I have something selected and I want to make it bold, I can hit Control+B. Okay. Gloria, I see you're on.
Yes, can you hear me, Art?
I can hear you just fine.
Oh, wonderful. Good. I'm back. I just wanted to say that there's a few people that are chatting and commenting about how the resume process seems very overwhelming. And I think maybe you could give an encouraging word, just telling them we all feel that way when we're doing resumes.
Yeah, use the buddy system. And guess who your buddy is? We are. People like Glory and probably 100 people throughout the state have a lot of knowledge on resumes. And your opportunity during the COVID pandemic with career force locations is limited to virtual services in many cases. You've always had this option, but now, and some people feel it's the only option, and when we open, you can certainly come in, but you can always reach out to us and ask for a resume review or ask for someone to just listen. You know, I'm having trouble with this. How do I get started? Or every time I enter some information, it seems like it's a waste because it never comes out formatted correctly and I don't want to send it to an employer. At that point, when you've got something on a document, when you put pen to paper, give us a call. I'll be giving you the contact information for all 50 locations of Career Force within the state of Minnesota. Find the one that's closest to you and start developing that relationship. I'll tell you just a story about Glory. Glory, in many cases, gets someone's resume and she looks at it and she's like, huh, I know someone who would fit perfectly, an employer that are looking for those skills, because employers call Glory and she is exposed to more jobs than the average job seeker would be, and she helps people get jobs based on that initial conversation of, hey, could you look at my resume? Anything you'd like to add to that, Glory?
Yes, I also would like to say, because we are the first point of contact for getting those jobs, a lot of times we also know what the employer is wanting to hear. So we can give you that inside scoop to, actually place on your resume as well. I have one more question, Art. There was somebody who asked, is it okay to use half-inch margin on your resume?
Yeah, I did cover that. I would recommend against it simply because it makes it look like it's too crowded. So I would edit for content to make sure that I'm not crowding. I want enough what's called white space, and that's the space between sections, your margin. It gives your eyes a break. It allows you to focus on something. So in the example here for the standard format, we got a lot of white space. But imagine if this entire PowerPoint were jam-packed with text. It'd really be hard for you to focus on what I'm talking about. This is doubly true in PowerPoint, but it's also true in your resume. You need to have enough white space. Now, you don't want to have too much white space. You got to have something to say. And I've seen people use half-inch margins, use 8-point font, and then space like 3 inches in between sections. That's an example of reformatting your resume to look more appealing. So as far as bolding, when you bold something, it's used to draw your eye to that area. It's often used for headings. The mistake a lot of people have used over the years is they use it too much. And when you emphasize everything, nothing is emphasized. So what I've seen people do in the past is they will look at the keywords from a job posting, and every time those keywords would appear in their resume or they inserted in the resume, they would highlight them or they would bold them. And I get why that people did that for a period of time. Today, it makes it look a little messy, at least in my opinion. And by the way, resumes are all about opinions. The only opinion that matters is the employer you're marketing yourself to. So as much insider knowledge as you can get from talking to people like Glory, who knows local employers in her area, or talking to someone who works at a company will really help you to market yourself appropriately to that employer. Underlining, used very specifically for sections. You don't want to underline things that aren't like section headings. In fact, some people will say, and I've heard in the past, that if you had a line in your document, I'm going to do it real quick here, that the computer would not be able to read it effectively. So this underline would cause a problem. I would disagree with that currently, and the reason is most employers that receive your resume as a Word document, there's very little that'll get in the way of them being able to parse that information or search for keywords. So things like tables, tables are used to format Word documents all the time. I choose not to use them because they're hard to edit, but a lot of resume templates are based on tables. The one thing I would stay away from in your resume is something called a text box, and it would look like this. People would use text boxes because it made it very easy to put information in a certain area. Of course, they would take the borders away, but you could move this around very easily. And they thought, well, that's a quick and easy way to format. Sometimes resume software will not look appropriately at text boxes, so I would stay away from that format. Other than that, though, lines generally don't have an issue. If you happen to know that your resume is going to be scanned from a paper copy, then I would stay away from lines because that can cause an issue of it thinking this is the end of the page, and then it'll skip down 3 inches to get to the top of the next page. Gloria, is there a question?
Yes, they're asking about templates. Where do you stand on templates, Art?
Oh, again, I like the way you phrase that. Where do I stand? Okay, because this is very specific to my opinion. I don't like them. I understand why people use them because it makes it easier. So if I were to go to File and New, I could find a resume template very easily. Well, let's see how easy. Okay, and now take a look at these, and I hope you say, oh my goodness, my resume doesn't look anything like that. That's what I mean. You're getting things that pop, things that draw attention. In my area, and I live in Duluth, none of these would be appropriate. These would be something that says, you don't understand the current job market. So using a lot of color, putting your picture on a resume, generally not accepted in my area. But even a simple resume, if I were to download this simple resume template, what you're going to do is you're going to find that it's got all sorts of little things that you can click on. It says, here's your Twitter, put your Twitter. I've had people say, not decided, undecided for my Twitter handle yet, because they didn't know what a Twitter handle was. It's got a lot of fields. What that means is it is much harder to edit. You're stuck with what they want your resume to look like, which you may be okay with, but here's the problem. Every resume is a specific marketing piece to an employer. And if you need to change your marketing piece based on a very hard to edit initial document, you're unlikely to do it. So I like creating my resumes from scratch, which is harder, I get that, but in the end, it makes it much easier to adapt them to a new situation. Was there another question, Gloria?
Well, I just was going to back that up. I couldn't agree with you more. It is difficult to start your resume on a blank document, but then you've got a lot of flexibility on the words you can put in there too. Sometimes with those templates, you can only use so much space, and you need to add more in there and tell more about who you are. I think a lot of employers too, when they're looking at the templates, right away they're like, oh, I wonder if this is really true or if the template put that in there for you. So it can accidentally discredit you. I do have one more question here, Art. It says, is PDF just as good as Word doc? And what are pros and cons?
Well, we do have Jerry Taylor also on this call, and if Jerry could unmute himself, he would tell you all about why we wouldn't use PDFs in certain circumstances. End result, just fine. The employer doesn't mind. As long as you are converting it to a PDF, it should be just fine. I get about 50-50 between Word documents and PDFs. There are some very beneficial reasons to use a PDF, with one caveat. Don't scan a document into a PDF, meaning that don't take, I wish I had a piece of paper here, a piece of paper that's maybe crumbled or got a little dirt on it or whatever, and if you scan that in and thinking that it's going to be perfectly fine, it won't, because it'll scan it in many cases as a picture, and it won't be able to pick up on the digital characters. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't, depending on how you scan it. But if it's not scanned correctly, it will just look like a picture of a bird. And the company's resume software will not be able to pick up those keywords. The main reason I am against PDFs personally, as someone who works for the job service, is once you export something or save something as a PDF, you can't edit it very easily. It's very difficult to edit. So we get a lot of people coming into our career lab who have a PDF file that someone helped them with, and they say, all right, I just need to change these 5 words to be specific to the needs of this next employer, and an hour and a half later, we kind of have something for them. It's not very easy to do. Gloria, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I just had one more question, and Rhonda has asked this a few times, so I figure I better get to it before we move on. She wants to know, how did you put that line in the header again?
Oh, sure. So there's a couple different ways of doing that. So you get your information in. I'm being really lazy here. And then I want it to stand out, possibly. And I honestly, I do this on mine. I like it. All you do is you go to the bottom, and then you click on, in the paragraph grouping, there's a borders option. You click the drop down, and you choose either bottom border, which is fine, or a slightly different option is horizontal line, which is right here, and it'll look a little bit different. They're treated a little bit different format-wise, but it's a quick and easy way. I used to draw them in, and that never went very well. So those are the 2 quick options. Again, either the border option on the paragraph grouping of the home tab, or you can also choose from that same menu drop-down horizontal line. So again, great segue. The next one I'm going to talk about is italics. My feeling on italics is use sparingly. We used to use italics a lot more, but now it just makes look like there's just a lot going on in your resume format-wise, and it's very hard to focus in on what you're drawing attention to if you're using 3 different ways of drawing attention to various things. So I'm not saying you can't use italics, but be careful with using it. I guess, I don't know if that's a firm enough answer, but I generally don't use it a lot. And if I do use it, I use it consistently. Like maybe I want to bold a heading, and then within that heading, I have some subheadings. I might italicize those subheadings. Yeah, so someone does mention this. I think the purpose of using a PDF is to avoid changes. So I agree not to use for resumes. Some people want it that way, though. They want to send their resume off as a static document, meaning that it can't be edited. And if you're paranoid thinking that an employer is going to change your resume, I would not apply to that particular employer. There are some other benefits. When you save something as a PDF, it hides what are called non-printing characters, the spaces, the enters, the tabs. If you don't know what you're doing on a resume, that can look really ugly, meaning that instead of centering something, you spaced over to get to that center. In a Word document, they'll be able to see that if they know what they're doing. On a PDF, they don't. Again, probably never going to hear that from anyone else but me, but I'm a big believer in keeping things as a Word document. That way, you always have access to an editable option. All right, we're going to move on. A note about capitalization. So this is technically a format. It's something you can choose to apply to selected text. You can say, I want to capitalize this whole thing. It's one of the few times that we actually do use all caps in a relevant way. If you're doing it in a document, meaning like a cover letter, that would mean like you're yelling at somebody, and we certainly would never want to do that. But in a resume, it's a good way of calling attention to section headings. I don't like going up and down with font size, but if you bold and capitalize a heading, it's going to stick out. The problem with that is, as you can see here, and probably have some people who are cringing at this, it doesn't catch spelling errors. By default, Word looks at all caps as like an acronym, and it doesn't spell check them. And I've seen many, many times that someone gives me a great looking resume and they say, hey, I just want to make sure everything's fine. Can you give me one last look? And I do what I'm about to do here. I change everything to lowercase, and we find that there are misspellings. I found 6 on one resume, and this person had paid a lot of money to have their resume done, well, a lot, over $100, to have their resume professionally done, and the person hadn't checked it. Hope they got their money back. So all you would do is you would select that information, and then on the Home tab in the font grouping, there is something called Change Case. You would click on that, and you would put it to whatever you want. I would put it to lowercase in this case. And as soon as you put it to lowercase, it's going to say, wait a second, that's not spelled correctly. And it'll allow you to right-click and change those misspelled words. And eventually I'll get a blue line here because this is a misused word. That's the difference. And then you select it again. You go back up to change case. You put it back up to uppercase. And now you have a spell-checked, reformatted heading that you can be confident is spelled correctly. I'm just going to read a quick question. I had a job with a lot of responsibilities. In this situation, how do you pick the most standout skills to keep your resume within these parameters? Okay, so that's a good problem to have. In fact, that's an excellent problem to have, is that you've got too much good stuff. What I would look at, I would try to differentiate between required skills and helpful skills, or however they format it. The ones that are at the top and the ones that are under required, those are the most important. Also look at your knowledge of that industry. How much are you going to use that skill that is listed? I mean, they may say ability to lift 50 pounds and over, and you may be able to lift 100 pounds and over. It does not mean you need to put it on there. That's just something they have to put on there. It's a great problem to have too much good stuff, but at the end, make a master resume, put it all on there, and then selectively edit out the stuff that's not as important as the other stuff, and you front end that. Gloria, looks like you have another question?
Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment and add to what you were saying, Art, because you are absolutely right. And I also think that you have to be careful so that the employer's not looking at your resume. You've got all of the skills, and many of them don't pertain to the job you're applying for. They could look at that resume and come to the conclusion, well, obviously you didn't even read the job description and you don't know for sure what kind of job you're applying for here, and you'll get ruled out just for that. We always think that the employer is excited and wanting to interview you, but what I found was that when the employer, if they have, say, 50 resumes in one job, what they're actually doing when they're going through those resumes is they're ruling you out, as opposed to they need to narrow it down to 3 people, and that's all that they are being paid for to interview. So make sure that your resume is tailored specifically towards each job that you're applying for.
Yeah. 17 seconds is the time frame I've been giving people for many years. I've heard it go up, heard it go down. That's how much time you have for an employer to view your resume first go around. And if they have a lot of information on there that is not relevant to their position, or not the most relevant to the position, they may go on to someone who has a more narrowly focused resume that really hones in on the most important parts of the job. It is tough, and I understand that, but it's one of the things we need to do for every job we apply for. We can take one more question, Glory, before we move on.
Yeah, this one is a really good one, Art. That's why I came back on. It says, I've worked many temporary jobs. Do I list the temporary company or the positions?
That depends, like everything on your resume. So if I worked for 5 years on a temporary basis through an agency for one company that was pretty impressive, then I may choose to put the company name there and put through Anywhere Staffing or something. However, one of the problems with working for a temp agency, even though a lot of people love working for just the diversity of skills that are developed and things you're exposed to and the experience you get, or just the be able to do something different is very attractive to some people. The problem on a resume is when that happens, it looks like you're jumping from job to job to job if you list the employer that you were actually physically at. Thing to remember is when you're working for a temp agency, your actual employer is that temp agency. So it's perfectly legitimate to list the time you work for the temp agency as the overall time span. So you would say, manpower from 2016 to 2020. And then underneath that, you could have subheadings of the actual employers you worked at and the time frame you worked at each of those on the left-hand side, or not right aligned. I'll send everyone, I've got a mock-up of this, basically a template that demonstrates exactly how you would format that, and I'll send that in the follow-up information. Thanks for the question. So alignments. These are pretty straightforward. The key to alignments is they're paragraph wide, meaning that you can't, based on the alignments I'm talking about here, you can't have a left alignment, center alignment, and a right alignment all in the same paragraph. So these are found on your home tab, and they're right here on the paragraph grouping. So you notice that this is center aligned. This is always the preference. You always want to do it this way for a heading. I mean, you don't have to have your heading centered. There's other ways of doing it. However, if you're going to center it, use the center alignment. I've seen people use tabs. I've seen them use indents. I've seen them use spacing. Spacing to get someplace makes me cringe. I get why people do it because it's the most obvious thing to do. But remember when I was talking about that non-printing characters? Here's the difference. If I turn on this little thing right here, it's called the show hide. It will show an employer that I used 70 keystrokes to do something that could have been done with one click. Now I get that not a lot, there's some jobs that don't require you to know how to use Microsoft Word, but this is the only example of your work that they're going to see until they get to meet you. So you want to make it look as good as you can, and the way you do that is you use the proper format. So you just click on center align. Some other things to think about. One of the things I see misused is the justify format. And I'm going to just do a quick, while we're on the center, don't center your whole resume. It makes it look like a weird hourglass type thing. I see people overusing centering. The only time I use centering in a resume is for my heading. After that, for the most part, you should be left aligned. So I'm going to put up some quick text here. And you'll notice that on the left-hand side, everything's aligned very nicely. If I were to choose some of these paragraphs and do something called justify, it will space things out in between words, and it'll line up very nice on the right-hand side. So if you ever look at a magazine or a book, you'll often see that they do this format. In fact, it can even possibly be used within a cover letter. I would not recommend it within a resume because what ends up happening is sometimes you get things like this, where it overspaces or it exaggerates the spacing because we're only doing one line. There's reasons it does that. I just try to stay away from justification alignment or justified alignment within a resume. Lori?
Yes, there are some people that are, their ribbon isn't looking like yours. So can you show them how to correct that?
You may not be seeing the ribbon at all. If you don't see the ribbon at all, on the top of your screen, there's something called ribbon display options, and you might have it looking like this. or you might have it looking like this. Okay? If you have Microsoft Word installed, any newer version, you will have the option of changing your ribbon view. And so it's this ribbon display options by your program control buttons. If you click that, different versions have it located in different spots. You want to say show tabs and commands. And then I always do it that way, by the way. I get why people would want to hide the ribbon because it gives them more space to work with. The problem with that is I'm not using my tools then, I'm just typing. All right, I don't have the option for the header. Not sure exactly. Ron, if you could just clarify what you mean by that, I will.
Do you know what, Art? You just answered it.
Okay.
That's exactly what she's talking about.
Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Thank you.
And that you're okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We do use right alignment within resumes, but we don't use it through a paragraph alignment. In another section of this class, this is part 1, we'll get into some more complicated or more involved formats in future classes, and we'll talk about something called a custom tab, and that's how you would get your dates to align. So your dates would align on the right-hand side, your jobs would align on the left-hand side, even though they're within the same paragraph. But as far as right alignment, the only time I've used that, and I do use it occasionally, is you'll see some headers that are used, like I might put my header on here, and to make it stand out, instead of centering it, I might right align it. And the header is the one thing that I do recommend you bump up the font size a little bit. You don't have to make it huge, but it should be bigger than the rest of your document to make your name stand out. That's just how resumes normally look. You could go up to 18-point font. There's been situations where I've gone even higher, but for the most part, 18 point should be about right. You don't have to do the rest of your address in that size. You can do it in the 11 point or whatever else the rest of your document is. I like to keep the font size pretty consistent other than the name throughout the document. That way my eyes aren't going up and down trying to refocus on things. It just looks more professional and cleaner to do it that way. All right, next we're going to talk about spacing before and after paragraphs. Now this is just a very specific instruction I'm going to give you, and I do have it laid out exactly as you would do it so you can follow the clicks. If you, once you receive this, or if you're trying to do it now, that's fine also. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. So if I were to have Orange and Street and City. Okay. Now when I look at this, I don't want to have those spaces in between there. It looks goofy in a heading. It would look perfectly fine after a paragraph in narrative text, like in a cover letter. But what happens is every time you hit enter in Microsoft Word, you create a new paragraph. Okay, and this is what it looks like as a non-printing character. This is what an enter looks like to Word. Okay, so every time you hit enter, you get another one of those things. So in newer versions of Word, what it's done is it said, you know, when you hit enter, you always want to have a blank space between paragraphs, so we're going to space that for you. And that would work great if I were typing a book or something. But in a resume, it can kind of mess things up, and it can make it look like too much white space. So what I do in that case is I just select the information, and I go to the Page Layout tab. There's a couple different ways to do this, but I go to the Page Layout tab, and then in the paragraph grouping, there's an option for spacing. And where the offending format here is spacing after. It's saying that after every paragraph, let's put in a 6-point enter or a 6-point space. So I just change that to 0, and I hit enter, and there I fixed it. Okay. The one thing I've seen people do to kind of get around this, I'm going to undo this a couple times here. I'll get it back. Is instead, maybe they have their resume all set up and they've chosen a font. I'll use something kind of crazy, and they made it bigger, and they say, oh, I don't like that extra space. So they select it, and they see this up here that says no spacing. Okay, that's actually a style, and part of that style, which a style is just a collection of formats, part of that style is 0 points after. But notice what it does when I click on that. It changes it to Calibri, 11-point font, left align, and no spacing. So even though it does work, I'm going to have to now reformat that whole thing with the extra formats. So again, it's going to select the information that you want to remove the spacing from. In this case, this is what you would do. Page layout, and then the spacing after, change that to 0, and then you're going to get 0 spacing in between. All right. Indenting. Let's talk a little bit about indenting. So indenting helps content stand apart from headings. So when you want something to move from the left margin of your document over a certain amount, like let's say a ½ inch. So I'll give an example here. We could do, maybe it's, and I want to move over thank goodness for spell check. None of my resumes would get past the screening process if it wasn't for spell check. So make sure you're using spell check. Again, I get the issue of the spacing, but notice that this went over a ½ inch. Okay, there's a couple of different ways to do that. There's a couple of different ways to make things go over a ½ inch. In this case, I actually use something called a tab, a default tab. And that's what this looks like. It looks like an arrow when you turn the show hide on. So if I were to hit the tab key, it moves over a ½ inch in most cases. But this time it didn't. This time there is no arrow, even though I hit the tab key. And the reason was, that's not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is to do the indent. There's many reasons why we use indent, but the indent is right up here in the paragraph grouping. I think the keyboard shortcut is Control.
Art, you're muted. Art.
So what happened there is I was trying to use the keyboard shortcut, and the WebEx was saying, that's my keyboard shortcut, and it muted me, and it was going to close the event out, so I'm not going to use any more keyboard shortcuts. What you would do is you would click at the beginning of this, you'd go to the paragraph grouping, and you would click on Increase Indent. The beauty of that is it moves an entire paragraph over. So let me use my little example I used before. If I wanted to take this entire paragraph and move it over, hitting the tab key only moves over that first line. Okay? If I hit Increase Indent, it moves the whole thing over. And you'll see this sometimes when you have a heading and maybe it's a skills section and then you want the skills to stand out, you might indent that over ½ inch. So the rule of thumb usually is when I want to move the beginning of a paragraph over, use the indent. If I want to move something over within a paragraph, meaning like maybe from the title of the job to the dates I worked there, I would use the tab key. So within a line, tab key, at the beginning, use the indent. So it aligns the entire paragraph that it pertains to. Now, there are a couple of different parts to the indent. There's something called a first line indent. That would be used for when we used to indent the first line of a paragraph in a letter, not used a whole lot anymore. It's also part of the bullet format that we're going to work with here in just a minute. And one last thing I'm going to mention is when you're not using bullets, and I really like this for the education section at the bottom of your document. I don't like having a bullet to be in the last line of my resume because it looks like you're trailing off into nothing. I instead block it by using a section without bullets, and I use the indent instead. Glory?
I think this is a really good question. It says, what's the best overall layout for a resume? It seems like if I ask 10 people, I'll get 10 different answers.
Yes, you will. And I'll give you the 11th, 12th, and 13th answer because there are 3 that I recommend. And it all depends on who you're marketing yourself to and what your job history, what pertains to that. So what I'm going to include, and this, if you've taken a resume class through the job service or through the career force before, you probably already received this, but I'm going to include 3 templates for you. The resume class we run next Wednesday is all about what you put in a resume. I'm talking about how you build a resume. They're going to talk about what you put in that resume. However, the template is still relevant. So there's 3 types of templates that we generally recommend. One is a chronological template, which means that it's the traditional resume in which you list the most recent job you worked at, and then you go in reverse chronological order with supporting skill statements within those jobs. That works very well if you are working within the same industry as your past job and you have had a career that has shown that you've been promoted within an industry, and now this next job is the next logical step. I don't know about you, but I haven't run into that a lot in my career. I generally go from this type of work to this type of work to this type of work. And because of that, I would use a functional or skills-based resume that would allow me to talk about what's relevant in that work history. So the reason you're getting conflicting ideas is in every given situation, people have what has worked well for them and their clients or themselves personally, but also every situation within your job search would give a different answer. The third option is something called a combination resume, which is a combination, obviously, of a skills-based and a chronological resume that uses parts of both. But I'll send those templates to you, and you can choose which one is the best. But again, if you have current work history, use a chronological. If you have relevant work history that's not as obvious to an employer based on the titles of the position, you can spell it out a little better by using a functional or skills-based. Yes, Claire?
Yes, there's a question here that says, can the indent be edited, say changing from a 1/2 inch default to a 3/8 inch?
Yes, you can change pretty much everything. I would not change the default. I just wouldn't. You can change the default in tabs. There's all sorts of different things. But what you can do is you can change the indent to whatever you want by dragging it up here. The indent is this hourglass looking thing on your ruler. And if you, if you use the increase indent, it's just going to go 1/2 inch at a time. But if I wanted to do it to a very specific time, maybe I want to do it to 1/8 of an inch, I would move it to 1/8 of an inch. Right? If I hold the Alt key down while I'm doing that, I have control. I'm holding the Alt key while I drag that that indent. I can do it to 1/100th of an inch if I really wanted to. I've never needed that specific of an indent, but usually 1/4 inch increments are just fine. So you can put it to 0.25. A little harder to get there. In fact, it's easier to do with Alt key, but I've got it exactly at 0.25 inches. So yes, you can manually change it anytime you want. There is a setting and indentation. I could put it at a certain amount and then set it as a default here. And by the way, this is where I get to my tab defaults also. It's on the paragraph dialog box launcher, and this is getting a little bit beyond what we're talking about today. But in the paragraph grouping, those settings would be in this little arrow right here, which gives you more options. And that's how you would change your indent defaults. Again, I don't recommend changing your defaults. They're there for a purpose, but situationally, you can change them to whatever you want. We'll take one more question, Glory.
Well, this is kind of more of a comment. Somebody commented, I feel like I've completed 3 resumes and none of them are good. I just wanted to throw out there that, resumes are enduring. Second off, that's why it's important to involve us at the career force to help you with that, because I highly doubt that they are not good. But instead, what we can do is we look at resumes all day, every day, and we can come to the table and help you with fine tuning that resume so that you can actually get the job. A lot of times when you're doing your resume, I know if I'm doing my own resume, I get sick and tired of doing it, and I get almost like a glaze over my face, and so I miss some things. So I have had a client one time, I took a look at his resume and I said, is there a reason that you have this one sentence on here twice? And he said, I didn't even notice that. I had another gentleman one time, I said, okay, your resume looks great, but I don't understand this one bullet point that you have here. Could you tell me that? And he read it and he said, "What? I don't understand it either." He said, "My wife put that on there." So the thing is when that happens, then you have ended up disqualifying your whole resume. So it is highly important that you do your own resume, but to have us come alongside you and maybe throw out some different options and ideas. But we've done it so much now that we are, the point of your resume is for you to get the interview. So we're able to help you with that. Thank you, Art.
Yeah, so the term I use is you become too close to your resume. It's really hard to objectively look at something that you already know what it's supposed to say. It's very easy to miss things, and it's shocking, actually, what I've missed on my resume when I have my wife look at it. She'll say, "Well, why did you put this on there?" And I don't have a good answer. I looked at it 20 times, and I never noticed it. So very important to have someone else look at it. If you really want to get the most bang for your buck, when you are applying for a job and you've got a resume that you created for that, attach the job posting and the resume, send it to a career force location, and ask for someone to try to find the relevance. Say, does this market me effectively to this job? And then we can look for keywords, and we can really help you fine-tune that resume. No one's going to write a resume for you. That's a long process that is so personal. But once you've got your job history on there, once you've identified some skills, and by the way, next Job Club, we'll be talking about skills identification. I'll give you a lot of tips on that, and that should be the first step before you even write a resume, is identifying what you're going to market on that resume. It's not just the job titles. It's not just the time you spent in a specific physical location. It's what you did there and what you did well there and what you liked there. That's what you're going to market. So once you get all that stuff together, we can turn a so-so resume into a really nice, clean, crisp marketing piece fairly quickly. And the next thing I'm going to show you is going to give you a really good idea of how that happens. So we're going to talk about bullets. One of the inconsistencies I find in a lot of resumes has to deal with bullets. And I wish I knew why. Bullets are strange. There's a lot of things going on with bullets. You're combining, at least in the past, a tab setting, an indent setting, and a symbol all into one format. And because of that, it creates some inconsistencies. The more you work with the resume, the more often you get like a blank bullet that for no reason whatsoever, it all of a sudden show up on your resume. This is the standard bullet. And the way you bring up the standard bullet is very simple. You just turn on bullets. So let's say that I had something here and I wanted a bullet. It's on the top left of your paragraph grouping. And really, this is all you need to know about it, unless someone changes it, unless you change it. If you change it to something like, let's say, a school bus, that's what's going to be there the next time you turn on your bullets. Okay, so being able to adjust it. We'll get more into bullets next week, but I want to kind of give you the basics of it right now. Gloria, is there something before I...
Bullet question here, Art. Somebody's wondering, how do I shut off bullets when I've moved on or to a new section?
Yeah, two things. One, you hit enter and you get another bullet and you're like, well, gosh, I don't want that other bullet. That's okay, hit enter once again and it will retroactively turn off that bullet and bring your insertion point up one row. I did that really fast, let me do it again. So I hit enter here and I've got another bullet. So the question is, how do I turn off those bullets? There's two ways. One is hitting enter. Now, if I hit enter here, technically I should go down one more line. I don't. I stay on the same line and I remove that bullet. That's what hitting enter on a blank bullet does. Also, I could go up and just turn it off. And turning it off will bring me back to my left margin or wherever I left off. Once you get it, but I remember the same frustration, like, how do I get out of this thing? It's, another bullet. And if I want to change the bullet, I just select it. I go up to my bullets and my drop down here. That gives me more options, and I choose the standard bullet. I know that seems boring, but if you look at this, this is a fancy bullet, and I do see some people use this. This is a blank bullet, and usually it's not chosen, it's forced upon you. All you have to do is select that bullet and change it to the standard bullet. In a resume, unless you're applying to be a music teacher, and even then I wouldn't do it, don't use anything fancy or funny or cute. like smiley faces. I was helping someone in an employment situation, and she used smiley faces for her bullets. And I said, why are you doing that? And she said, I want to work at a happy place. So do I, but I won't have the opportunity to work in that happy place if I use smiley face bullets on my resume in most cases. Of course, you may run into that one employer that thinks that's really nice and accepts it. I'd rather go with the tried and true, what works for most people, which is the standard bullet right here. What happens with bullets, though, is they get away from us. If you're typing a resume and you know exactly what you're doing and you're typing it all at once, which never happens, by the way, your bullets will be very consistent because you're not changing formats from one to another or doing things with tabs or indents or whatever. But what seems to happen, at least I have found, I've created an example to show you, pop up, is this. I mean, this is over dramatizing what it looks like, but your bullets start not becoming lined up. Maybe they change to a blank bullet. Has this ever happened to anybody? Have you ever had bullets go bad on you? Just put it in the chat box. Maybe I'm the only one this has ever happened to. Oops. No, okay.
We have quite a few yeses though, Art.
Okay, good. I'm not the only one then. Well, if this ever does happen to you, I'm going to give you something that is probably going to be your greatest takeaway from this entire hour and a half we're together today. I hope you got a few things, but this will be the greatest takeaway. It's in resumes, this is your best tool. First thing you're going to do is check this, though. Sometimes when you have bullets that go all over the place, it's because you did this. You selected them, and you forgot to turn off the centering option. And centered bullets, no matter what they're set at, will not be lined up. They'll be kind of in a wavy format. But in this case, that's not the issue. In this case, they're just, each one of them has different settings. And if you look at the ruler here, you see I have the indent settings here, which affect bullets. And if I click over here, they're slightly off. The way you fix this is two ways. One, you could go to each and every one of these, or you could select the whole group, and you could go and change your bullet and define new list and go through a whole bunch of settings. Don't have to do that. All you have to do is agree on one bullet you like. So I like this bullet. I like where it lines up. It lines up at 1/2 inch, and the text lines up at 0.75 inches. So I like it. And that's, by the way, the first line indent of your indent is where your bullet lines up. The hanging indent is where your text lines up. So if I were to move this, it would change that. If I were to move this, it would change that. I'm going to keep it as it is. I'm going to say that 1/2 inch and 0.75 inch is my good bullet. So all I have to do is click on that. I don't have to select the whole thing. And by the way, you cannot select a bullet. I click in the line the bullet applies to, and I'm going to click on Format Painter. But I'm going to double click on it. I can either single click or double click. If you single click on it, what I'm about to do happens one time, and then you got to start the process over. I'm going to double click on it. And now what I have is a little paintbrush on my cursor. And what that means is I have copied the formats of that paragraph on my cursor. Wherever I click thereafter applies those formats to that section. And I could just select and drag over them, and I can do that. Now, if you've struggled with bullets on your resume in the past, I'm hoping this is an eye-opening experience, because now look how very, very, very organized that looks. It looks well formatted. The difference between that and this could be getting an interview. It really could. It could be that simple, because even though the text is exactly the same, this just looks jumbled, it looks unorganized, and this looks consistent and well formatted, even though it's the same exact information. So if you're ever wondering about Format Painter, all you have to do is hover over the tool, which is in the clipboard grouping of your Home tab, and it tells you exactly how to do it. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. Or, and not a lot of people do this, but once you understand the tool you want to use, to find out how to use it, just Google it. Type in Format Painter MS Word into Google, and you'll get 500 videos that explain click by click how to do it. You'll find a training video from the Microsoft website. You'll get a Goodwill Community Foundation Learn Free training that will talk about it. But first off, you have to know that it's something that's worth getting into. So anyways, I've shown that to people, and some people have actually gotten mad at me because they said, why did you show me this 5 years ago?
Oh, I can relate to that, Art. Sorry. I think this is a really good question. It says, would you use bullets in your qualifications, summary, or profile?
Yeah, it depends on how it's formatted. I mean, if it's a narrative, no. If I wanted to say something like office professional with 20 years of experience in the training and employment field, I wouldn't use bullets. But if I wanted to say, something that was like a list, I could. And you do see some front end qualification summary that would use that. Quite often you'll see it in a double bulleted list, and that would use something called a table format or a column format. I have traditionally, my qualification summary is, I'm going to give you 3 lines of why you should look at the rest of my resume. Remember, we've only got 17 seconds to grab them. Bullets in a summary statement, to me, are just throwing words out there. If they actually say something, fine, but if they're just trying to do a word match, that doesn't grab the attention as much as a well-formatted or formulated entry statement. I wouldn't go longer than 3 lines because, again, 17 seconds, they're not going to spend a whole bunch of time reading a paragraph. But also, I don't want to go too short because too short means that I'm not really saying anything. I hope that answered your question. All right, just a couple things, more things to go through, and then I'll finish the last 10 minutes with any questions you may have or any demonstrations you'd like me to give. So at the end of every Word class or Excel class I teach, I always want to give people access to some training because I know that in an hour and a half of very quick instruction without you being able to do it yourself, it's really hard to maintain anything I've said today. You may think, oh, that's great, that's interesting, but tomorrow it won't be useful because you haven't used it. So not a bad idea to go to gcflearnfree.org, and all you have to do is go to Google and type in GCF, Word, and whatever version of Word you have. If you're using LibreOffice, I would maybe put in Word 2003 because it's going to look more similar to that. And then you click on the first link you're going to get, and you're going to get really good instruction. I've been using this for years and years and years. I have not found anything better for free on the internet. It'll walk you through all the parts of Word that you need to know to create a really nice resume that's well formatted and that meets expectations of people who look at resumes every day. And that's something to keep in mind. Remember, you may be very good at what you do, but the person who is looking at your resume doesn't do what you do. They look at resumes all day, and they're trying to match that resume up against a job posting that tells you what we define as the skills needed for your job, not what you define. So matching what they need to what you have accomplished is the entire purpose of a resume, which is counterintuitive to some people because they think, I know how to do this better. Well, that's not going to get you an interview. Gloria.
Boy, I couldn't, I totally agree with what you just said, Art, because it's interesting how we think in our head that this is what the employer wants to hear when it'll actually rule you out again. I think this is a really important question too. If you could talk a little bit about transferable skills, Art. So somebody wrote, what if my industry has been crushed by COVID and I'm switching careers? My former skills have a very niche to them.
Yeah, well, they all seem niche until you look at the bigger picture. So try to think about how would you explain what you do to a 7-year-old. I was doing math with my 7-year-old yesterday, and I use different terms. I have to break it down. I have to break it down to its base components because she doesn't know what I know. And no employer is going to know your niche industry, so you've got to think about what are the transferability. When I was first starting out in work, I had worked as very early in my career doing just straight data entry. That's when computers started making their ways into offices. And I sat all day at a green screen and I typed in, all day, every day. Didn't talk to anybody, just typed. And later on in my career, I worked with Alzheimer's residents. and there wasn't a computer in the place. It was I was a PCA or a CNA, and later, and what I did was I was all cares. It was all direct cares, no computers in sight. I was able to take those two industries and define the transferable skills to a completely other type of industries. And that other industry was teaching computer skills to people with disabilities. I was able to pick and choose what relates. Patience, being able to repeat the same things without getting angry, explaining things at people's level of understanding. And then, of course, the technical proficiencies of the computers. That's what it's about. It's describing your skills in their terms or for their needs. And some things are universal. If you've got customer service skills or clerical skills or soft skills are very transferable. But even within the hard skill sets, there are parts that are transferable or that you can make a case for. And again, really important to get a fresh set of eyes on those skills by talking to your local career force representative. Phone conversation is as technical as it has to be. Just set up a time to call, email them your resume and the job you're interested ahead of time, and they can look at it with a fresh set of eyes and not be really hampered by the technical knowledge that you have of your skills. They're going to look at it and say, well, don't you have to do this too? And you're going to say, well, of course, anyone would know that. No, they would not. An employer would not know unless you tell them. That's a common question. I'm glad you asked it, Gloria. All right. At this point, that's all I've got for you today. So we can deal with any questions, or I can demonstrate more on the screen. Anything you would like me to show based on what I've shown you already, or any questions, general questions you have.
So Art, I'm not 100% sure this question. I'm hoping you can understand it. It says, in your computer skills section, you use present case and past together.
Yeah.
Shouldn't only one case be used? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
okay.
Yes, that's a great question. And I'm not even sure which exact slide that was coming from, but I think I've got one here that will demonstrate this. You got to be very careful about this. So acts as troubleshooter, and then delivered over. So this means it's in the present tense. This means it happened in the past. Now you got to be very careful about this. It's much easier in a chronological resume. I'm not even saying this is the proper way. This is just a demonstration. But if you notice that this is a current position, because this is the current position, it's in the present tense. If it happened in the past, absolutely great point. Make sure it's I call it the ED method. It happened in the past. I see a lot of people mixing their tense, and it confuses an employer. And by the way, I really messed up this whole thing to make it look bad, and that's why maybe I've copied and pasted things around between present tense and past tense. I think that answered the question. I think I understood it correctly. If I did not, please let me know.
Yeah, it looks like you did good. This one says, sometimes the program can flake out. Point out the Office 365 online backup.
So if I had access to Office 365 at this point, I would certainly bring that up. If you're talking about the online backup, that's OneDrive for if you're using a Microsoft product. Office 365 has OneDrive really built into it. It's part of the package. So when you're saving to the global net. You're saving to the cloud storage, which basically means it's server space or computer space that Microsoft pays for or provides for their customer on a subscription basis. For most of the free users, you have a limited amount. Let's say 2 gigabytes up to 15 gigabytes. And that's perfectly legitimate or perfectly useful for most people. And the reason is this document I just created is about 20 kilobytes, meaning that it's really, really small. I could create resumes for the rest of my life, and I would never completely use up all of the free storage space that I would have on Google Docs or on OneDrive through a free account.
I was just looking real quick here. Somebody's asking about the skills workshop.
Yep.
what is that? When is it at, and what's it actually called? That would be our next Tuesdays.
Yeah. So whenever you want to find any, there's two ways of getting to any of the offerings we have through CareerForce. And I'm going to quickly try to bring up the website. And Glory, I think I can actually do this. I'll copy and paste it into the text. And this is included in the follow-up material also. But it's the virtual and interactive services for career seekers. Many people find out about our events through a mass email, but you can register for any event that is offered, and there's usually 3 per week at this website. So the next one is Job Club Online. It's the Identifying Your Skills, Job Applications, and Work Portfolios. And if you click on that, it'll bring you to the registration link. And let's just try to do an immediate, there we go. I just sent the registration link. You would register just like you did for this class. You go log into your Minnesota Works account, and you would be able to then get a activation email that has the WebEx address the day before the event, just like you did for today. All right, we have time for one more question, if there is one. And if
Yep, there sure is. So it says, how do you align your dates at the end of a resume again?
Okay, I didn't show you that. I will show you that though, but it's a teaser for the next class. Okay, so if you get lost in this, don't worry about it. It's going to be brought up again. However, it's with something called custom tabs. The problem here is I can't both at the same time say that I worked as a cook and then also say that I did that from 2017 through 2020 on the same line and have this lined up perfectly on the left-hand side and this lined up perfectly on the right-hand side. I can't do that with alignments because it's all or nothing. I'm either left aligned or I'm right aligned. I guess I could potentially try to trick it. No, can't even do that in this case. There are ways around that. What I would do in this case is I would set something called a custom tab. So it's a two-step process. What you would do is you would put a tab in between the cook and the dates, just hitting the tab key basically, and that's what that looks like. And then what you'd have to do is choose the tab setting that allows you to do that, which is, in this case, a right tab. Your tab indicator box is up here, and then I would just set that tab on my right margin. And then you set it once, and now you could say I am a gardener. And then when I hit the tab key from there, it's going to jump again to that right tab setting. And I could say that I worked there from this time. And notice what it's doing there. It's starting on the right-hand side and pushing to the left. If you can't wait for this, the lesson that I recorded and included in this document is the Advanced Microsoft Word course that is on, I think, slide 3 or 4 of today's presentation, and that will be sent out to you also. By the way, one last thing here, and I know we're going to be just about at time. If you want to look at any of the previous recordings of classes that have been offered, of course, you can't ask your questions during these because they're just on YouTube. They're also included on the virtual and interactive site. So the one I just recommended, the Advanced Microsoft Word, you would just click on that and you could watch that presentation. All right, Glory, anything before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to reassure everybody that after the class, we do sit down and look at the chat. So if we didn't get to answer all of your questions, we will when we send out the information to you through your email.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I always appreciate the time to talk a little bit about Microsoft Word and resumes. It's what we do the majority of our day here is help people with resumes, and any help that we can give you in assistance with that, I really recommend you look at your local CareerForce location so you can start developing that relationship. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for
Bye, everyone.